Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to my November letter to him calling for 8 measures on bushfires, including a coordinated national approach endorsed by COAG, appropriate emergency services funding, more aerial firefighting assets, financial support for volunteer firefighters and action on climate adaptation and mitigation. Why did the Prime Minister summarily dismiss Labor's constructive proposals by rejecting a national approach to the crisis, saying COAG might meet later, quote, should the need arise?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm sure the House won't be surprised that I don't accept the Leader of the Opposition's characterisation of these issues, Mr Speaker, because what I can tell the House is the government's response to the national bushfire emergency over this black summer has been, Mr Speaker, unprecedented. Unprecedented with the compulsory call-out of the Defence Force Reserves, which is the first time, Mr Speaker, the first time that has occurred, Mr Speaker, in response to a national disaster of this kind. In addition to that, Mr Speaker, we moved quickly to establish the National Bushfire Recovery Agency, Mr Speaker, and to appoint Andrew Colvin, the former head of the Australian Federal Police, Mr Speaker, which I thought those opposite supported these measures, Mr Speaker, but they come in here on the first question of the day and seek to politicise the bushfire response. Now, I find that very disappointing, but I'm happy to inform the member that we not only provided additional support for aerial firefighting assets, that is the water bombers, but we actually provided a further $20 million, Mr Speaker.
Will resume his seat. The members on both sides. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. It goes to relevance. My question very specifically went to my correspondence in writing to the Prime Minister in November and his response.
Yes, the Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition. No, the Leader of the Opposition will not debate the matter. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The question mentioned a number of things in the correspondence, and the Prime Minister is addressing the response to the bushfires. He's in order. He's entitled in doing that to mention other actions that have been taken. The Prime Minister is in order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We provided the additional funding for those water bombers, and then we provided additional funding on top of that in response to the request from the fire chiefs who had sought that additional support. They sought 1 extra. We provided 4 extra, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I note the constant interjecting from the Leader of the Opposition, and he's been very chatty on this issue today, Mr Speaker. I would have thought that he would be supporting these measures. If he wants to politicise bushfires, that reflects more on him than it does on the government, Mr Speaker.
Members on both sides. Member for Corangamite. The member for Cowper.
Question is to the Prime Minister.
Member for Cowper, just pause for a second. Member for Cowper, pause. Members, cease interjecting. The member for Cowper will start his question again. I couldn't hear him. The member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison-McCormack government is working practically to meet the challenges Australia faces, including responding to the devastation this bushfire season has caused for communities across Australia, including in my electorate of Cowper?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Chair, I thank the member for Cowper for his questions, and I note the interjections from those opposite, again on the issue of an important question about bushfires. Mr Speaker, I was with the member for Cowper in Wauchope during those bushfires that ravaged the mid-coast, as I was with other members across the mid-coast and up the north coast as they went through those communities, and I saw the devastation with him and my many other colleagues as we visited the many areas that are affected by those fires, including with the New South Wales Premier, who was there with me on that occasion as we went to Wauchope and we visited the Incident Response Centre. And I want to thank all the members for their great cooperation and support, as we did in this House yesterday when we commemorated and when when we memorialise, Mr Speaker, the terrible losses that were endured over this bushfire season, this black summer, Mr Speaker, and one that continues to this day. But what this government has been doing for the last 6 years has been ensuring that the government has been in a place to build the strength and resilience, particularly of our financial resources, to ensure that at a time of crisis we can act. And in a time of crisis we can move forward and put resources into place, and that's why we established the National Bushfire Recovery Agency under the leadership of Andrew Colvin, and to immediately put in an additional and initial $2 billion to support the bushfire recovery effort and the rebuilding process to build back better, which this government will lead and ensure we're supporting those people on the ground. And we were able to do that, Mr Speaker, without applying an emergency levy and tax on the Australian people. We didn't have to do that like our predecessors did, Mr Speaker, because we were in a position to do so because we have brought the budget back into balance. That is something those opposite were unable to do, and the only way they could provide that support is if they taxed other Australians. Now, we have not done that, Mr Speaker, because we did the work to ensure that we rebuild the financial resilience of the government to be able to act, to provide $76 million in important mental health support, to ensure that we're providing $50,000 grants to small businesses directly impacted by these fires, and a further $500,000 in loans where you don't pay anything back for 2 years, no interest, and then discounted rates of interest over the balance of the 8 years, to ensure that we're providing $70,000 grants, Mr Speaker, $75,000 grants to primary producers, and more than $6 million of that support is already out the door, that we've provided over $100 million in the disaster recovery payments to over 75,000 people, and including over 34,000 children, to ensure that they could be supported, particularly as they went back into school, that we've supported our tourism industry, that we've supported those who are supporting wildlife and habitat, and the council's providing the response. That's action, that's the response.
The time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is again addressed to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister regret using his official resources to create and launch a party political advertisement on a catastrophic day at the height of the bushfire crisis, which included defence imagery, a jingle and a link to a Liberal Party donation button?
Members on my left. Members on my left. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition has come to that dispatch box and called a complete falsehood. Mr Speaker,
members on my left.
The government and the members opposite know, Mr Speaker, on any— I note the constant interjections on matters of bushfires, Mr Speaker, from those opposite. But on every piece of communication that you provide in video, the advice is that that material must be authorised, Mr Speaker. And I have noted that the Leader of the Opposition—
Prime Minister, just pause for a second. The Prime Minister can pause for a second. I mean, I know it's the start of a new year and it's the first question time, but members won't have forgotten the number of times I've said it's important for me to hear the question and the answer. I am going to hear both. If that means ejecting people, I'll do it very freely, and bear in mind I haven't done it for a while, so I've had a bit of a break and we're now back. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Those communications require an authorisation to be compliant, and that's what the government has done. That's what the Leader of the Opposition has done, Mr Speaker, with his video communications on these types of issues. Mr Speaker, the only people trying to politicise the response to the bushfire crisis is the Leader of the Opposition.
The member for Herbert has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House the action the Morrison government has taken to establish a national and permanent rolling commission into veteran suicide and its prevention, so we can better serve and protect those who served us, including veterans in my electorate of Herbert?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, and I thank the member for Herbert for his question, and I thank him for his service, as I thank all members of this House who've served in that way in our Defence Forces. I thank all Australians who've served our Defence Forces veteran and who are currently serving, and I thank them for their service. The price of peace is eternal vigilance, and we must be eternally vigilant about the health and well-being and the mental health and well-being of our veterans and our service personnel. Veteran suicide is heartbreaking. Any suicide is heartbreaking, and the incidence of suicide amongst our veterans, Mr Speaker, is alarming, 2.5 times the rate of what it is otherwise in the population. And, Mr Speaker, the actions that we've decided upon, I commend the Minister for Veterans Affairs for the excellent work he has done in consulting and listening, not responding in a knee-jerk way to this, Mr Speaker, to leap onto an issue. He did the work of listening and understanding and caring. And in response to that, it has been his recommendation to the Cabinet, agreed to this week, that we will establish a National Commissioner of Defence and Veteran Suicide Prevention. This Commissioner will have the rolling powers of effectively a Royal Commission, Mr Speaker, to ensure that we can look at every single occasion, to understand it and learn from it, to ensure that we can prevent any further such suicides amongst our veteran community. And in addition to that, we'll be ensuring that it has the first task to look back at those veteran suicides that have distressed so many, Mr Speaker, and to learn the lessons and to understand what needs to be done to address those situations. But there will also be a Veterans' Families Advocate, because as we listen to the families, and in particular I pay tribute to Julianne Finney, Mr Speaker, who led this courageous and brave advocacy to bring this to our attention, to understand it. And my response to her is that we have needed more than a Royal Commission, and I was pleased to speak to her last night and convey to her the decision that we'd made, and she told me that she was going to tell her son. Mr Speaker, this is the right thing to do. This is the right response. This puts us on the footing of eternal vigilance on behalf of our veterans to ensure that we understand what happens, the stresses that they are under and the terrible outcomes that occur from the decisions they take in these instances. But I want to say this, though. Our veterans are strong, our veterans are not broken, our veterans have served and they continue to contribute to our country, and they are outstanding contributors. And if you're a veteran out there today, all of this chamber believes in you. All of this chamber believes in your capacity and your potential. And if you're a veteran out there today and you're daily battling this chamber, the other chamber, this nation stands behind you, and the National Commissioner for Defence and Veteran Suicide Prevention will be there to support you.
And the Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
Yes, Mr Speaker. I associate myself with the support for action when it comes to veteran suicides. I spoke to Julianne Finney just last week. It was the day after the anniversary of her son's tragic death, and she had not visited the grave of her own son, who went into the Defence Force to defend our nation and who was tragically just one of the many victims of suicide of veterans. We called for a Royal Commission last year, but we are not going to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We will support what the Prime Minister has announced. We will be vigilant to make sure it's properly resourced, and we say that today is a day which should give comfort to people in the veterans community, including Julianne, who've campaigned so strongly for this.
And questions?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his previous answer, where he suggested that it was necessary to have a Liberal Party authorisation on his ad, which had a Liberal Party donation button attached to it. Isn't it a fact that only electoral matter requires party authorisation, and there is long precedent for government information which is not party political to not require such an authorisation? The only reason why it was authorised by the Liberal Party is because it was so political.
Concluded. The Prime Minister has
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The video presentation was posted on my Facebook page, Mr Speaker, and that requires an authorisation, and that is the advice that is provided to me. That is the same, Mr Speaker, as is practised by the Leader of the Opposition, and I table, Mr Speaker, his tweet that says listening to people, respecting people, putting forward practical suggestions that would make a difference. That's what I've been focused on. That's what I'll continue to. Authorised by Anthony Albanese, ALP, Canberra, Mr Speaker. I have just followed the practice of communicating with the Australian people. For the Labor Party to characterise it in the way they have, Mr Speaker, is simply false and a misrepresentation by a Labor Party leader who wants to politicise the bushfires.
Members on both sides. The member for Sydney is warned. The member for Sydney is warned. The member for Gorton is warned. And the member for Warringah has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Prime Minister, in a time of crisis, the Australian people have rallied and been united in their response. They are looking to us now, in this place, for unity and leadership to be safe in the future. It's been predicted that without action now, impacts and events resulting from global warming will get much worse. Will you honour the sacrifice of all those impacted during this bushfire crisis by showing bipartisan support for effective, long-term plans to lower our emissions, mitigate the worst of climate change and, united, keep Australians safe?
The Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the member for her question. In the Royal Commission that we are seeking to establish, and I've written to the state and territory premiers and chief ministers to get their comment and feedback on that Royal Commission terms of reference. There, Mr Speaker, it is accepted that climate change has impacted Australia and that we're in for longer, hotter, drier summers, and that there are actions that we need to take to protect Australians into the future. Those actions are many, and in my address to the National Press Club last week I set out what they were. Of course, Australia must continue to take the actions we are to meet and beat our emissions reductions target, which have already seen us reduce emissions, Mr Speaker, by 12.8% since 2005. We have emissions reduction target that we took to the Australian people out to 2030 that will see emissions per capita fall by half. Mr Speaker, we are ahead of countries like New Zealand, we're ahead of countries like Canada in meeting and beating our targets. Mr Speaker, some 411 million tonnes we will have beat our Kyoto emissions target, and at the same time our renewable energy, Mr Speaker, per capita is half what's being is double, I should say, more than double what's being achieved in Germany and in many other countries around the world, and we have one of the highest levels of investments in renewable energy anywhere in the world, Mr Speaker, in the developed world, and we have one of the highest, in fact we have the highest target of emissions reduction out to 2030 in Asia compared to those nations. Now, Mr Speaker, emissions reduction is important and we're acting on that reduction, but I can tell you also resilience to climate is also important, and hazard reduction is important, if not more important, than emissions reduction when it comes to protecting people from fire and hotter, drier, longer summers in the future. Also, Mr Speaker, in a country ravaged by drought and the impacts that we have experienced, and that drought continues, building dams is climate action now, Mr Speaker. That's what it is. All of these measures, resilience, adaptation, emissions reduction. I see the puzzlement on Labor members' faces, Mr Speaker. They don't think building dams is a way to ensure that we're building resilience for a climate in the future, Mr Speaker, which is racked with the impacts of longer, hotter, drier summers.
Prime Minister will pause for a second. Prime Minister will pause. The member for Griffith will leave under Standing Order 94A. And the member for Hunter is also warned. Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party don't seem to understand that one of the things you have to do to make your climate resilient into the future is to build dams. And we've got to broaden this conversation, Mr Speaker. We've got to broaden the conversation about climate. It must deal with resilience. it must deal with adaptation and it must deal with emissions reduction. But this government will not tax people more to get emissions reductions down. We won't put their electricity prices up to get emissions reduction down, and we will not wipe out industries to get emissions down.
Has concluded. The member for Hinkler has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison government is building resilience to ensure regional Australia recovers and thrives after the devastating bushfires?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Hinkler for his question. Resilience is an important word, and no more important than after the summer we have had and the summer we're still enduring. The fire season is not over yet. But our communities are resilient, Mr Speaker. They are the best, the strongest, the bravest communities. Regional Australia is made up of people who are so resilient, so courageous, and in the face of these fires, Mr Speaker, they want to build back better. Build back better, that's the theme of the National Bushfire Recovery Agency, headed by former Australian Federal Police Commissioner Andrew Colvin. And those communities, they do want to build back better. They know how much this fire season has had an effect on them. They know the toll. But, Mr Speaker, as I said yesterday, as we were honouring our bushfire victims and our bushfire-affected communities, regional Australia ain't broke. Regional Australia has optimism. Regional Australia has a bright future. It will build back better after these fires. It will build back better after this drought, and we'll do it by building more dams, as the Prime Minister has just said. We will do it by helping businesses such as Greg Mowatt's apple orchard in Batlow. And I know the member for Eden Monero would probably know Greg Mowat. He's been a family businessman since 1926. He wants his son Richard to continue the family tradition of growing the best apples that he can, Mr Speaker. And of course there's Barney Himes, there's Ian Cathills, they're great apple growers. And when an apple orchard burns, Mr Speaker, it takes years to replant and years to get the full recovery from those fire effects. But build back better they will in Batlow, Mr Speaker, and in Tumbarumba and in Tumut, where their pine plantations have been so devastated. This is indeed devastating for the Visy Mill. The GDP, the local Shire gross domestic product, Mr Speaker, for Snowy Valleys is underpinned 70% by pine plantations, and I know how much of an effect this is going to have on Hine and Visy, but they will bounce back because they are resilient. All of the communities I visited, I went to
Deputy
Queensland.
Prime Minister will pause. The member for McNamara can end his conversation and leave the chamber under 94A. I'm not going to have. I'm just going to say, particularly to the second Deputy Speaker, I'm not going to have people bellowing across the chamber when I'm trying to hear the answer. So, the Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I visited Queensland, I visited New South Wales down the south coast, I visited in Victoria, and I talked to fire authorities, firefighters there, Mr Speaker, CFA firefighters, who had saved the town of Walwa by a change of wind direction, Mr Speaker, and they were looking forward to helping their community, helping Gingellic, helping all of those communities, Mr Speaker, to build back better. And I'm glad that in Auburn, which is in the Wagga Wagga local government area, Mr Speaker, we've provided that Category C assistance so that they too, even though the local government area isn't devastated by fires, but they can get the help they need.
Concluded. The member for Gilmore.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Why does the Prime Minister claim he always acted on the advice of fire commissioners when he ignored for 2 years their advice to provide a permanent boost to Australia's aerial firefighting capability?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the member for her question, and can I, through her, pass on again my sincere condolences and sympathies and support to all of those members in her electorate. I have members of my own family who live in your electorate, and I want to thank you for the work that you've done, as all members have done over the course of this bushfire season in supporting their local communities. I'd be grateful if you could do that if you have the opportunity. Mr Speaker, the member has raised the matter of the recommendations that were made through fire chiefs regarding the aerial firefighting assets. And what the government had done was respond to that with 2 separate tranches of funding which matched what they originally asked for, Mr Speaker. And I dealt with this matter during the course of the bushfire season, but in addition to those 2 funding allocations of $11 million, on top of that we announced a further $20 million, and that was over and above the $15 million that was being provided each and every year as part of the arrangement that we had, Mr Speaker. We were pleased to do that. I also noted that the ongoing funding which was being sought would be addressed in this year's budget.
The member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer explain to the House how the Morrison government's responsible budget management provides the financial resilience necessary to respond to economic shocks like the coronavirus, bushfires and drought? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Lindsay for her question and note the work that she and members of her community have done to help those in fire-affected areas. The provision of community care kits that have had linen and pots and pans and stationery for kids going back to school and the like, all prepared by the member for Lindsay and her team in her electorate. Mr Speaker, it's been a devastating summer, taking lives and destroying livelihoods with the bushfires. We've seen the ongoing drought and, of course, the coronavirus and the harm that it has brought. The Morrison government's response has been unprecedented. What we have seen in relation to the drought is $1.3 billion of commitments since the election, on top of what was previously announced. In relation to the bushfires, and the Prime Minister has alluded to it, the establishment of the National Bushfire Recovery Fund, $2 billion, which is initial and additional to other payments and allowances that the Commonwealth makes through the states, Mr Speaker. Money for mental health, money for the tourism sector, money for small businesses and for primary producers, and money for wildlife habitat restoration and to support those many animals that have been injured in these bushfires. Now, Mr Speaker, our ability to respond to these crises has been enhanced by the fact that we have been disciplined economic managers, Mr Speaker. We inherited a budget deficit of $48.5 billion, and we've delivered the first balanced budget in 11 years, Mr Speaker. And this has given us the ability to spend on those areas of need, Mr Speaker. We have a strong economy. We have a strong economy because more than 1.5 million jobs have been created since we've come to government. Unemployment under Labor was at 5.7%. Mr Speaker, today it's 5.1%. Mr Speaker, under Labor, employment growth was a third of what it is today, Mr Speaker. Under Labor, 62,000 small businesses closed their doors in their last year in office, and in the last reported year, Mr Speaker, 75,000 small businesses have been created by this government, Mr Speaker. The contrast is very clear. Now, earlier today, the Governor of the Reserve Bank addressed the Press Club. This is what he said, Mr Speaker, about the Australian economy. The Australian economy's economic fundamentals remain very strong, and they provide a solid foundation for us to be optimistic about our future. Mr Speaker, I want to repeat that. This is the Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia. The Australian economy's economic fundamentals remain very strong and provide a solid foundation for us to be optimistic about our future. Mr Speaker, there's only one group of people who are talking down the Australian economy, and those are those opposite.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister explain how his entire office found time to attend a marketing seminar run by ad man Russell Howcroft on a catastrophic fire day in December? Why did the Prime Minister organise a meeting with Russell from marketing but refuse to meet with the 23 former fire chiefs who were pleading for the government to take this bushfire season seriously?
The members on my left, the Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, Mr Speaker, the meeting that you refer to was not a meeting that I attended. Mr Speaker, the meeting that you also said was requested and has been well publicised, Mr Speaker, related to former fire chiefs, as you know. I engage with current fire chiefs, Mr Speaker, and the current fire chiefs who had provided the advice, Mr Speaker, going into this fire season was the same fire advice that was provided by Emergency Management Australia when I asked Emergency Management Australia to come and brief Cabinet well before the fire season, Mr Speaker, last year to advise us what was necessary and to ensure that we were compliant and that we were taking action to ensure the Commonwealth's position was in the best position it could be to support state and territory authorities as they moved through this devastating fire season. That included the additional funding that we announced that I referred to earlier in response to the member for Gilmore's question, in providing the additional funding to support the aerial bombers. It assured, Mr Speaker, that in November, the government undertook a trial program for the compulsory call-out of reserves to ensure that in the event that we were to move to that situation, it could be done seamlessly. Now, Mr Speaker, this has been one of the most significant responses of the government to ensure that we went from a situation from around 895 Defence Force personnel that were on the ground in December to 6,500 and more that were on the ground in January. That changed because the government changed the disposition of the Commonwealth's deployment of Defence Forces on the ground, not to respond to requests, but to take this to the extreme of constitutionality, Mr Speaker, the extreme of constitutionality to respond, Mr Speaker, to the situation that emerged that week where on the Thursday it was the first day that the natural state of disaster had been declared in Victoria. That hadn't occurred before. That happened on the Thursday. There was the compulsory call-out on the Saturday, and the preparations for that compulsory call-out were already underway when Victoria made that declaration. Mr Speaker, those opposite, in their questions today, are betraying a willingness to seek to politicise this disaster, and it's very disappointing.
The member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Can the minister please update the House on the steps the Morrison government is taking to protect Australians from the spread of coronavirus?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Moncrieff and many members of the House on all sides who have been deeply engaged in ensuring that Australians are well informed and well cared for. Our number one task and priority at this time is to protect Australians, to protect their health and to keep them safe. The latest update I have had shortly before coming into question time is that the global figures are 24,531 people have been confirmed with coronavirus, and sadly 492 have been confirmed as having lost their life to the illness or complications arising thereof. 2 of those are from outside of mainland China, and 13 Australians have been confirmed with the virus. 3, thankfully, have cleared the virus and have now, after significant testing, been discharged. I've also just been informed that the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has been able to confirm that there are 2 Australians with coronavirus on a cruise ship in Japan. They will be provided medical assistance and I'm advised will be given passage to an appropriate medical facility in Japan, and we thank the Japanese government for that. On the 21st of January, the Chief Medical Officer, who's known to many, if not all, in this House, Professor Brendan Murphy, declared human coronavirus to have potential for pandemic under the Biosecurity Act. That led to a series of different actions. One, what has happened is that we have stood up the National Incident Centre, and that has been running around the clock 24 hours a day under the leadership of Celia Street, but with the guidance of the Secretary of the Health Department. 2, the National Medical Stockpile has been mobilised, and masks have been made available to GPs, I think 550,000, with another 550,000 in reserve. And in addition to that,
500,000 masks have been made available, with an initial tranche of 300,000 for airports and ports, for passengers and for workers. In addition to that, the National Trauma Centre has been mobilised under the leadership of Len Nataris, and they provided OSMAT, or medical assistance teams, to support the patients and the evacuees to Christmas Island, as well as on the first humanitarian flight out of Wuhan. A series of additional activities, including daily hookups with the states through the Chief Minister, have been occurring. A humanitarian flight which has successfully brought people to quarantine, and the upgrading of our quarantine arrangements. The Prime Minister has authorised an additional flight, and actions are now being taken in conjunction with the Chinese government. We thank all of those who have led this at the medical level. We thank the Chinese government for their cooperation, and we make this message to the Australian people that we will get through this. We will get through this.
The member for Hunter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Why is it that yesterday, when the rest of the Parliament was focused only on memorialising bushfire victims, National Party ministers and members were more focused on fighting amongst themselves?
The Leader of the House. Members on my left. The Leader of the House.
Even on the broadest interpretation, that can't be related to the ministerial duties of the Deputy Prime Minister.
I'll just hear from the Manager of Opposition Business, and given unusually the question was short, I might ask it be read again, if that's okay in your...
Yeah, thanks, Speaker. The question asks about the actions of ministers. That's what it specifically asks about, and it asks about National Party ministers, of whom the person who's the question's directed to is one himself.
Yeah, but I think the problem with that question is it's the Deputy Prime Minister can only be responsible for his portfolio area. He can't answer with respect to other ministers' responsibilities. I mean, that's a... Sorry? He is the Deputy Prime Minister, and the big point is he's not the Prime Minister. That's the point. And the Prime Minister can be asked anything, and every other minister can only be asked. So it's an unbridgeable gap, I've got to say. I'll go to the next question. This will be good. It's a little bit of time for reflection is often good, that's all. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
On the point of order, Mr Speaker, perhaps the Deputy Prime Minister might want to answer this question.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. I made the point to a former Prime Minister that wanted to answer a question that wasn't in order that I really didn't care whether they wanted to answer it or not. If it's out of order, I'm not going to allow the question. Otherwise, it makes a mockery of the standing orders. The member for Mallee.
My question is to the Minister for Water Resources, Drought, Rural Finance, Natural Disaster and Emergency Management. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison-McCormack government is working to build resilience in communities that have been affected by drought, including in my electorate of Mallee?
The Minister for Water Resources.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the honourable member for Mallee for her question and her leadership of her community through one of the worst droughts in our nation's history and in Mallee's history. And rightfully, while a lot of the attention has been on the devastating fires over this summer, we as a government have not forgotten those impacted by drought and our response to it, our over $8 billion response to this disaster that has spread like a cancer from one side of this country to the other. And only last week the Prime Minister and I went to Orange to meet with the new Drought Advisory Committee led by Shane Stone to make sure that the commitment that we as a federal government has made is hitting the mark and getting money out there and supporting our three-pillar national drought strategy. Also making sure that there isn't duplication with the states, because the states also have a responsibility in this. But our three-pillar strategy is having an impact. And the first pillar is around the here and now, putting money in farmers' pockets through farm household allowance, giving them the dignity and respect to put household items, to be able to put food on the table, to be able to live with some dignity and make some decisions with the help of rural financial counsellors. The Regional Investment Corporation, we've introduced new loans, $2 million for farmers, $500,000 for small businesses. That means they will pay no interest and no repayments if they refinance their debts from commercial banks to the Regional Investment Corporation. We are taking that out of the big banks' pockets and putting it back into farmers' pockets. But we understand the drought extends past the farm gate. It goes to the communities that support them. And last week we announced another 52 shires that can apply for up to $1 million under the Drought Communities program to be able to stimulate these local economies, the small businesses in these towns, get new money flowing through these communities. Also, in terms of education, with children going back to school, taking the burden, the cost of education, another $10 million to help families pay for those education expenses, to take that burden away at the start of this year. But we're also the first government to look to the future with drought. We've created a new future fund. And in fact, next week, that plan, the Future Fund plan that will give a dividend of $100 million a year, will be presented to this parliament. This is a plan that the parliament will decide on, not politicians, a political decision. This is about making sure that it's done in an equitable and proper way. But we're also investing over $3 billion in dams. We're looking to the future to try and build the resilience. We've got the money on the table and we're asking the states, who have the constitutional responsibility to build the dams, to take our hand and work with us, hand in hand. We've also asked them to come with us and to pay the rates of small businesses and farmers and to remove payroll tax in these drought-affected communities. The states have a role to play to support and complement what the federal government has done in its commitment to supporting regional and rural communities. Our national drought strategy is just about making sure that these communities not only survive but they thrive when it rains.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister fund all projects recommended by Sport Australia under the Community Sport Infrastructure Scheme but not funded by his government?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Funding these important infrastructure projects is and has been a priority of this government. We had, Mr Speaker—
Members on my left.
Mr Speaker, the program received applications for some $400 million. $400 million, Mr Speaker, and we allocated $100 million. Now, Mr Speaker, as I said last week, we think that this infrastructure is important to local communities, and I did say at the Press Club last week that I will be working with the Treasurer as we prepare for this year's budget to see how we can provide further support for Mr Speaker, this important infrastructure that brings communities together.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. This is a very tight question.
Yeah, no, the Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. I've listened very carefully to his question and listening very carefully to the answer. The Prime Minister is being relevant. Has the Prime Minister concluded? He has. The member for Moreton, you'll roll out the door in a second. The member for Reid has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is strengthening our nation's borders to protect Australians and build our resilience to the coronavirus emergency?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I want to say thank you to the member for Reid for her question. It's a very important one because the government's been working very closely with, obviously, the Health Department across government. All agencies, Mr Speaker, have been working very closely together. Agencies within the Department of Home Affairs have, particularly at our borders, through the Commissioner of the Australian Border Force, Michael Outram, been able to work with the airlines. As the Australian public knows, the Prime Minister made a decision, the right decision, to stop people coming in that weren't citizens or people in other categories, including permanent residents, who had been in mainland China on the 1st of February. Now, there is a significant logistical operation that's involved, as you would appreciate, and the Commissioner from Australian Border Force led that operation, and it's a great credit to him and to our staff at the airports. Obviously, we don't want to put our staff in any harm's way, but they were able to support people coming off those flights, to redirect them into the hands of some of the medical advisors who are there at the airport, to turn some people around back to their country of destination, and to make sure that this was all done in an orderly way. And the message, as the Minister for Health pointed out before, is that the government will respond to any of these incidences. We will make sure that, given we rehearse plenty of scenarios, that the National Security Committee of Cabinet comes together on a regular basis to look at ways in which we can respond to a crisis of this nature, that we will put whatever resources are required in place to keep Australians safe. And what we've had at the forefront here, Mr Speaker, is a desire to keep Australians safe here at home and to make sure that where Australians are stranded, whether it's in Hubei or Wuhan province, wherever it might be, that we can provide support to those people as well. As Australians know, we've been able to repatriate, with the assistance of a chartered flight by Qantas, 241 people. Those people are currently in isolation, and they'll be able to leave the Christmas Island facility when they get clearance from the doctors. Now, this is a fast-evolving threat, not just to our country but right across the world. We're working with the World Health Organisation. We are meeting daily with all of the state chief medical officers and all of those that are involved within the Home Affairs Department. We'll make sure that we do whatever is possible to support the orderly transition at our airports of people, as I say, in whichever direction they need to go. But we are doing whatever it takes to make sure that we can deal with this virus. And I really do want to commend the frontline officers from the Home Affairs portfolio, from the department, and we will make sure that we continue to do that work into the future to keep Australians safe both at home and abroad, Mr Speaker.
The member for Shortland.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Were the projects that received money under the Community Sports Infrastructure Scheme the ones that had the most merit?
Members on my left. Members on my left. Member for Lawler. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I believe funding community sports infrastructure always has merit.
Members on my left, the member for Monash. Members on my left, the member for Burt, the member for Rankin, the Leader of the Opposition. The member for Monash has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment. Will the Minister update the House on the steps the Morrison government has taken to help our native wildlife and landscapes recover from the recent bushfires and build their resilience to future fire events?
The Minister for the Environment has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Monash for his question and commend him on his extraordinary speech on the condolence motion for bushfires yesterday and the passion he shows for his affected communities in East Gippsland. There's absolutely no doubt that the damage to the built environment, the rural environment and the natural environment has been extraordinary. In fact, we have witnessed an ecological tragedy. Up to 80% of the World Heritage area of the Blue Mountains has been burnt, and that's just one example. Mr Speaker, I've travelled throughout the fire grounds, the mid-north and the south coast of New South Wales, the Adelaide Hills, and I've met with amazing people, with wildlife carers, with vets, with Indigenous rangers, with farmers, with state agencies and, of course, property owners who've been left devastated. The Treasurer and I announced a $50 million initial response for wildlife and habitat
Members on
recovery.
my left. The Minister has the call.
And we've appointed an expert panel chaired by Threatened Species Commissioner Dr Sally Box to advise on immediate and medium-term stages of recovery and our investment. Some 100 participants have attended 3 roundtables: environmental science, wildlife, land management, and they've really informed the development of this response. Mr Speaker, money is hitting the ground. For example, in 17 fire-effective natural resource management regions, we've signed new work orders, and we will see immediate work on pest, weed, feral animal, fencing off unburnt areas, all of that practical action on the ground. $5 million is going to Greening Australia for seed banks, $2.5 million for our Conservation Volunteers Australia. It's extraordinary that 10,000 volunteers have already lodged expressions of interest through.
Members on my left will cease interjecting or they'll be leaving the chamber. The minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is extraordinary to see the volunteer effort on the ground, and I'm sure members opposite have witnessed it. 10,000 volunteers registering their interest through an online portal with Conservation Volunteers Australia. Again, we will support that effort for practical action. We've provided $1 million each for Taronga, Zoos Victoria and Zoos South Australia. They are frontline in their conservation efforts to recover insurance populations and absolutely work at the front line of that important conservation. Small wildlife shelters will be able to apply for programs for their amazing backyard carers, and we will continue to coordinate strategies to build resilience against the impacts of climate change, from funding climate science through to practical actions that we see on our farms and in our community environment programs every single day. Our response to the fires will focus both on immediate recovery and a long-term plan for the environment that supports us all.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. In his previous answer, the Prime Minister failed to endorse decisions made by his own government to reject projects that had been assessed above 90 out of 100 for merit. Were the projects that received money under the Community Sports Infrastructure Scheme the ones that had the most merit?
Members on my left, the member for Cowan, the member for Corangamite. I haven't called the Prime Minister yet. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, as the member knows, the program was set up that gave total authority to the minister to make decisions.
Members
I'm
on
only
my left.
referring to what the findings were of the Auditor-General's report, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, that report articulated, Mr Speaker, that the authority to make those decisions was by the minister, Mr Speaker, and the Auditor-General's report made a very important recommendation which the government accepts. And that recommendation was recommendation 4, which deals with the issue of the application of the Commonwealth grant rules and guidelines, Mr Speaker. Now, as the Auditor-General's report outlines, which we accept, it says that those guidelines should be applied in the future by organisations such as Sports Australia. And the government has accepted that recommendation, and we believe that that will assist these.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business.
On direct relevance, the question does not go to future programs. The question goes to decisions that were made by this government and whether or not the Prime Minister believes those decisions were made on merit.
Before members on my left, the member for Cowan is not helping the Manager of Opposition Business when he's making his point of order. Just before I call the Prime Minister, I take the point of order from the Manager of Opposition Business. I heard the question to have exactly what he said and some other question at the end about what the considerations were. No? Okay, well, I'll listen to the Prime Minister carefully, and the Prime Minister has the call.
The point I was seeking to make, Mr Speaker, that the minister made the decisions about where the projects should be supported, Mr Speaker, based on her assessment that what would be the projects of greater support and merit in the community. And she had the authority to do that.
Prime Minister will just pause for a second. Prime Minister will pause. The members for Burt and Lyons will leave under Standing Order 94A. Perth, sorry, yeah. Sorry for the member for... I thank the member for Perth for putting his hand up. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker. So the minister who had the authority to make those decisions made those decisions, and as she's made very clear in her own statements at the time, that she was seeking to make those decisions in the best interests of that program, what it was seeking to do. Now, Mr Speaker, the point I was making is that the Commonwealth Government rules and grants rules and guidelines are there to ensure that where a minister may take a view about what she believes is a project that has greater merit, then there is a process for setting out how that might be different from what advice or recommendation she might have received. But I can tell you what the Auditor-General's report did not find. It did not find
members on my left.
That elected members of this House, it did not find that ministers should not be making decisions about the expenditure of public monies to suit the programs that have been established. The process is to ensure that you get good advice, Mr Speaker, and you can consider that advice, but ministers must make decisions. Now, if those opposite think ministers should be order takers from public officials who aren't elected, that's for them to say. I believe every single member of this House would advocate for the needs of their community. And these members advocated for the needs of their community. These members advocated for the needs of their community. And the minister made decisions, all eligible projects, and made the final decisions, as was her authority, under the program as it was established. Where there are improvements that can be made to that program in the future, they have been accepted.
Before I call the member for Flinders, no, I'm dealing with one first, if that's okay. The member for Solomon will withdraw an unparliamentary remark he made.
Which one?
No. I tell you what, members on my right, this is not going to take long, member for Solomon.
Oh.
You withdraw. Thank you. You either withdraw or withdraw from the chamber. It's pretty simple. And as Prime Minister indicating that the second Deputy Speaker, made an unparliamentary remark, I have no option but... No, you haven't got the call yet. You're certainly not going to question anything. You know the standing orders as well as anybody. If you want to ask a question, you can do that in another way. I'm in a situation where the Prime Minister's saying the second Deputy Speaker made an unparliamentary remark. All I can do is ask whether the second Deputy Speaker did make an unparliamentary remark.
I didn't, but for the sake of the House, I'll withdraw.
I thank the second Deputy Speaker. The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education, representing the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the minister outline to the House the steps the Morrison government is taking in response to the devastating bushfires and the outbreak of the coronavirus, particularly in relation to the education sector and the trade and tourism sector?
The minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Boothby for her question. I know she's a passionate advocate for the tourism, trade and the education sectors in this country and in South Australia in particular. When it comes to the bushfires and the coronavirus, there is no doubt that it has created an unprecedented challenge for our tourism, trade and international education sector. That's why the government is acting to protect jobs and to protect businesses. It's why the government is working with the tourism sector, the trade sector and the international education sector to minimise the impact of the bushfires and the coronavirus. My counterpart, the Minister for Trade and Tourism Investment, has been working with businesses, peak bodies and state and territory counterparts to put together a package for the tourism industry following the impact of the bushfires. It's a significant package. $20 million for the Holiday Here this year domestic marketing campaign, $25 million for an international marketing campaign to reinforce to global audiences that Australia is safe and open for business, $10 million for tourism initiatives to attract visitors back into fire-affected regions, $6.5 million to get more international businesses and buyers to the Australian Tourism Exchange, $9.5 million for an international media hosting program and $5 million for public diplomacy initiatives. The government is serious about doing all it can to help our tourism industry. When it comes to education, following the fires, there was an $8 million mental health support package which has been delivered through Beyond Blue. There's funding for school chaplains, funding for community childcare. Also, the childcare subsidy where the activity test debt has been exempted from those from bushfire areas, and special consideration from students from bushfire-affected areas for the rural and regional enterprise scholarships. When it comes to the coronavirus, my counterpart Minister, Simon Birmingham, is working with the sector to deal with the impacts of the coronavirus ongoing, and we continue to engage with them. My counterparts in the higher education sector we've been engaging with almost on a daily basis. State and territory education ministers we've been engaging with. We want to minimise the impact of the coronavirus on the education sector, on the tourism sector and on the trade sector in this country. It involves us all working together to do that, working with state and territory counterparts, working with peak bodies. We'll continue to do it because it's absolutely vital for Australia's economy and for us keeping all Australians safe.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I seek leave to move the following motion. That this House, 1, notes the Prime Minister A has repeatedly refused to admit his failings in handling the ongoing bushfire crisis. B has tried to cover up his failings with a series of false claims. C is ignoring the damning report of the Independent Auditor-General concerning his corrupt sports rort scheme and is instead relying on a secret report by his former Chief of Staff. D refuses to give straight answers to simple questions. E has no plan for this country, only a marketing plan for himself. And 2 therefore calls on the Prime Minister to stop acting in his own interest and start acting in the national interest.
Is leave granted? The Leader of the House.
Leave is not granted.
Leave is not granted. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I move that so much of the standing orders be suspended as would prevent the Leader of the Opposition from moving the following motion immediately. That the House, 1, notes the Prime Minister has repeatedly refused to admit his failings in handling the ongoing bushfire crisis. B has tried to cover up his failings with a series of false claims. C is ignoring the damning report of the Independent Auditor-General concerning his corrupt sports rort scheme and is instead relying on a secret report by his former Chief of Staff. D refuses to give straight answers to simple questions. And E has no plan for this country, only a marketing plan for himself. And 2 therefore calls on the Prime Minister to stop acting in his own interest and start acting in the national interest. Mr Speaker, the fact is everyone knows that this has
will
been—
resume his seat. The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, I move that the member no longer be heard.
The Leader of the House has moved the Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Division required. We'll ring the bells for 4 minutes.
Can't even give one speech defending themselves. Not one.
Lock the doors. The question is the Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Nichols and Gray tellers for the ayes, and the honourable members for Lawler and Werriwa tellers for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 75, noes 68. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question now is whether the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition is seconded. Oh, sorry, that's what I'm doing. Whether the motion is seconded. Manager of Opposition Business.
Motion seconded. This is a corrupt scheme from a Prime Minister who thinks taxpayers' money belongs
Manager of Opposition
to
Business
him.
will resume his seat. The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, I move that the member no longer be heard.
Question is that the Manager of Opposition Business be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. That the ayes have it. Division required. We'll ring the bells for 1 minute. And in this successive division, I appoint the same tellers. And as is always the case, members must remain in their seats unless they're leaving the chamber or changing their vote, in which case they must report to the tellers.
Not from their seat.
In my opinion, there's nothing wrong with it. And I should know. I'm an expert in this field.
Lock the doors. Appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or did not vote in the previous division, in which case they must report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 75, noes 68. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question now is that the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition be agreed to. I call the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Corrupt sports rorts.
The Deputy Leader will resume his seat. The Leader of the House has the call.
I move that the question be put.
The Leader of the House has moved that the question be put. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. If the ayes have it, division required. I ring the bells for 1 minute and I appoint the same tellers as per the previous division. Members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or leaving the chamber, in which case they must report to the tellers. Lock the doors. Appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Members must remain in their seats unless they are changing their vote or did not vote in the previous division, in which case they must report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 75, noes 68. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question now is that the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Lock the doors. Question is the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition be agreed to. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Lawler and Werriwa tellers for the ayes and the honourable members for Gray and Nichols tellers for the noes.
Thank you.
Order. The result of the division is ayes 65, noes 78. The question is therefore resolved in the negative. Okay, if members could just take their seats, we're still in question time. The member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veterans and Defence Personnel. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is supporting our veterans, and specifically how we're addressing suicide within both the serving and the ex-serving community?
The Minister for Veterans Affairs and Defence Personnel.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I do thank the member for Stirling for his question, and I recognise his service in uniform to our nation, as I recognise all members in this place who served, and say to them quite simply thank you for that service. And I know that I speak, Mr Speaker, on behalf of all members of this place when I say that the only acceptable number of suicides in our veteran community or our defence community is 0. And this government has made mental health an absolute priority in the Veterans Affairs portfolio over the past 8 months. And since election, I've conducted a national summit involving the ex-service community and experts in the field. We've also had a review of the national strategy, the action plan dealing with mental health issues, and that draft is out now for public consultation. And, Mr Speaker, very importantly, we've also listened to the families, the grieving families of those who lost their loved ones. And we did hear the calls, Mr Speaker, for a Royal Commission. The Prime Minister and I both met with families and heard those calls. And the Prime Minister asked me to look at all the options. And over the past 2 months, we have looked at all of the options. And the policy we announced today, Mr Speaker, our National Commissioner for Defence and Veteran Suicide Prevention, is better than a Royal Commission. And the reason I say it's better than a Royal Commission, Mr Speaker, is because it provides enduring powers to investigate all deaths by suicide of veterans and defence members, not just now but into the future as well, if that tragically occurs. We also announced today, Mr Speaker, there would be the appointment of an interim commissioner to review more than 400 deaths by suicide since 2001, and we announced the appointment of a family advocate, and those positions will be advertised in the normal course of business over the coming weeks. Mr Speaker, I want to take the opportunity today to thank the grieving families who had the courage to talk to me, to talk to Leader of the Opposition, to talk to other members in this place and to the Prime Minister. And for them I would say this is a victory for you, and I hope you can draw some solace from the announcement today. It doesn't bring back your lost sons and daughters, but it will help to save lives in the future. This is a very complex policy area. Each case is unique, and there are multiple factors that contribute to a person taking their own life. There has been some major change in the last few years, Mr Speaker. The government now provides more than $230 million through the Veterans Affairs Department for Veterans' Mental Health. We provide free mental health support for all veterans and their families. There is a new veteran payment in place, and I must say that those changes were all made with the support of those opposite. We now provide mental health first aid training through our RSLs, and for the first time psychiatric assistance dogs are being provided by DVA to veterans where we believe it can help. We're also working to improve the transition from defence into the civilian community. And I'd encourage anyone listening today who's concerned by anything we've said in this place that's affecting their own mental health to contact Open Arms on 1800 011 046. We need to start working together to reduce and prevent suicides in our veteran community. The hard work begins today. We have the basic framework in place. Now we need to implement it in cooperation with the states. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
And the member for Blair has indicated he wants to associate himself with the remarks of the Minister. The member for Blair.
Yeah, thank you on indulgence. I associate the opposition with the remarks of the Minister. Thank the Minister for the constructive way that he and his staff have worked with myself and the Shadow Minister for Defence in relation to the briefing today. Labor offers constructive bipartisanship. He's absolutely correct. One death is one death too many. I thank the brave men and women who serve each and every day and their families, and particularly the advocates who have fought for a good outcome for those it's serving and those in the communities they deal with, and we mourn with them. We mourn with them for the tragic loss of their loved ones.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And on that note, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.